Is Ireland being ripped off? According to my next guest, we're all currently standing by and watching as our country has been ransacked and stripped of its petroleum wealth. Bad political decisions made 25 years ago are now returning to haunt Ireland, and the onus is on us all to act now. As it stands, Ireland is not guaranteed any benefits at all from private exploration and extraction of our own resources. And a new book titled Our Own Oil, The Fight for Irish Economic Freedom contains the views of an eclectic group of experts who argue that through securing a proper deal, Ireland could prosper as an economy and secure much needed infrastructure. The man who put the whole thing together is Eddie Hobbs, and he's with me now. Eddie, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Pat.
Now, tell us about your own moment of epiphany in September 2012, because you would have gone along with the consensus that it's too hard to find the stuff in Ireland and too expensive to extract.
Exactly, and there was no evidence, and I thought that, everything that was happening over in Corrib was just, the planet before people types with the tattoos and all that, and, I was of the view that people were going to get in the way of people that were prepared to put private wealth into holes off our shores, and shouldn't we be delighted that they're doing so? And I was uninterested, and I was misinformed, and I was arrogant, and it was wrong. So what happened was Dublin Bay Concern formed around the idea that this rig was going to appear all of a sudden in Dublin Bay. An oil rig.
This is off Dalkey. There was going to be, in sight of all the expensive properties, there was going to be this rig, a bit like, I suppose, a windmill in County Donegal or County Kerry, an affront to the residents.
Well, it was going to hit the real estate prices of some of the most wealthy real estate in the country, and they came to me to talk about it, and I said, look, this doesn't have the aerodynamics to fly nationally. Most people would probably be delighted to see an oil spill coming ashore in Dalkey. It just annoy you, so you don't have an organisation that you're asking the wrong question. Now, to be fair, they had lots of other information on other matters, but the question really was, how the hell did the oil rig planning permission get this far to actually have it just off, a major European capital without any real apparent consultation? And that really caught my curiosity. So there's something fundamentally wrong here. And Dublin Bay Concern were made up of very, very smart people, started to throw a lot of literature my way, and I started to read into it. And it was only then I said, here we go again. What a mess. So we have a section in the book from a leading barrister, Dermot Flanagan, on how to reform the infrastructure area so that you can de-risk it for exploration companies and it makes sense for everybody, so we can all see into it. And he outlines various options. But we have an eclectic mix of writers. We're covering taxation. How do you change the taxation system to make it fairer, as well as industry, what's going on, what's the industry story, what's the backstory, the environment. We have school children writing in the book, so it really does go at the whole.
Okay, but the bottom line here was, you have on the one hand the people of Ireland being told by successive ministers that it is expensive. We're looking for people to gamble their own private money or investors' money in digging holes in the ground, whether it's off the east or the west coast or whatever. It's going to be very expensive to extract, and quite frankly, the state doesn't have the money to so do. But you say...
Exactly what the Norwegians were told.
Okay.
Exactly.
But you also say that the investors, the potential investors, have been told quite the opposite.
Oh, they are. That's quite clear as a game. The shareholders of the private companies have been told, look, there's tons of oil and gas off Ireland. And by the way, Irish are territorial waters. The actual geographical area we own is absolutely enormous. It's 6 to 7 times the size of the country. So when you're looking at the map of Ireland, as we often do, you're actually looking at the wrong map. It's much bigger than that. And that's what they're looking at. And there's a huge ridge of geology that runs from Norway across the North Atlantic to Newfoundland. And it is according to those that know this, it contains large oil and gas deposits. Now, what we're being told as a people is exactly what the Norwegians were being told in 1958. There is no oil off Norway. There was none. It's in writing in one of their headquarters as you walk in. And they did nothing until there was a change of attitude in 1972 when a new administration came in. And what they did was they changed everything with very little evidence of any oil and gas off Norway at that stage other than one strike. And that was They said, let's set a set of principles around this.
All right,
flow
now,
everything from that.
We tend to, in this country, reinvent the wheel again and again and again. But there was a minister, he's passed on now, Justin Keating, and he was minister at a time when the oil crisis struck and so on. But his thinking is worth listening to, and this is what he had to say recently before his death.
If the oil remained in the ground, my heart wasn't broken. It wouldn't get less valuable, it would get more valuable, as has happened. Well, now, the oil crisis weakened my hand a lot because oil grew in price in a short period by 5 times, and there was a worldwide recession. But worse than that, many of the chemicals that were oil-based disappeared off world markets. It was a very sharp crisis that we survived without people knowing how desperate it was in 73. But if you have the oil, as the company said, if you have the tankers, as the company said, if you can play supply on a global scale, we had very few cards in our hands. We had to beg them, please, don't let us run out. And in the goodness of their hearts, they didn't let us run out. But we had no clout, and they had all the clout. Then I came to realise that we couldn't abdicate our authority and power and responsibility and give it to the big oil companies. So we started to develop some expertise, to recruit some people, and perhaps the most important thing we did initially was to look at the developing situation in the rest of the world, and specifically on our own doorstep, well, almost, in the North Sea. One side of it Norway, one side of it Britain. Britain wasting their resource because the big companies were so powerful. Norway using it brilliantly so that they've now secured their future. They had far-sighted government and very patriotic, independent, determined to do the best for themselves government, and they just introduced what I think is still a brilliant policy.
So, the Norwegians introduced a brilliant policy. What was that policy?
Well, what they did in 1972 was they set up these, what they call the 10 Commandments. I won't go through all 10 of them, Pat, but basically they said, okay, we're changing all this now, that this has to lead to a qualitatively improvement, a qualitatively different lifestyle for Norwegian citizens. We own these assets, not the private oil companies, to set up their own operational oil company without any expertise, and to change their licenses so that the licensees would have to transfer their knowledge over to this oil company. That oil company is now Statoil. And the size of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund today is nearly 3 times bigger than the Irish national debt. And this was coming from a country that was being told there is no oil and gas out there, guys, and you're lucky that we're in here drilling at all. It's exactly the same template. But what changed was, and Justin Keating, to whom this book is dedicated, and his daughter Eilish co-writes with me the taxation chapter in it. She's an accountant, well-known accountant. Nails it. He said it was because of the ambition of a group of far-sighted, patriotic politicians in Norway, good people, that changed it around. They had to stand up to the oil industry at the time, which was a difficult thing to do in the climate that was there. And I think they were also just joining NATO. So they were under a lot of pressure, but yet they did it.
But they stood their ground. So it means that they were shareholders in the whole enterprise. The national oil company was set up, which became Statoil and so on. And the rest, as they say, is history. Justin Keating, for his part, introduced a much different regime, got it through the Dáil. He says in that interview, they knew, the rest of the cabinet knew how much this meant to me, so they didn't thwart me in that, and it got through, and there were some changes. Dick Spring became minister. He kept it, but he didn't change the fundamental thing, although he eased the conditions a bit. And then Ray Burke.
Then Ray Burke. And really, Ray Burke, well, just so that listeners understand, what Justin Keating did was exactly what the Norwegians did. He said, well, for starters, we're going to take a share of the revenues off the top line. In other words, every barrel that's sold, we get a share of that. That's what's called a royalty. He also said that there's going to be production sharing with us citizens, so that for every barrel that comes out of the ground or every cubic metre of gas, you're going to have to share that with the Irish people. And then there will be tax on any profits you make subsequently, because the profits will go on for 20 or 30 or 40 years. So Ray Burke comes in February, I think, 1987, goes to a number of meetings unaccompanied by senior civil servants. Now, this is all on the record stuff. And in the same year, the Irish royalty idea is gone, so there's no royalties. We don't get any cut off everything that's sold. There is no production sharing. That is gone. The cost of drilling can be now spread out over 25 years. There is going to be some corporation tax. That was subsequently then cut in 1992 by Bertie Ahern to 25%. But as we now know, and we do this in the taxation chapter, such is the agility and flexibility of the Irish taxation system, as we've seen with multinational corporations in Ireland, the headline rate is meaningless. It's all down to what can really be extracted.
And what they can write off.
Exactly.
In terms of their losses in other places, which is a crazy regime.
It is. Now you then say, well, who actually really wrote that regime? Who wrote it over the shoulder of Ray Burke? Would be that's a question that's lost in the mists of history now. But what we do know is this, that internationally, where you've excess capital chasing scarce resources, in other words oil and gas, national governments globally have been increasing their take. Now, as it stands, Ireland is the most generous regime on the planet. The most generous regime on the planet. So when you look at other regimes, the typical take that the owners, that's the people, rather than the state is separate from the people get is typically between 70 and 80% of what is made. Yet that still leaves an average return for oil exploration companies, Pat, of between 20 and 30% per annum, which is a very, very high rate of return to compensate them for the high risks. Now, that number is calculated quite recently by an international bank, Standard Chartered Bank, to who I refer in the book. And I went to them when I saw that and I said, well, that's very interesting. So I gave them the Irish tax model, which is contained in this huge 500-page document that Ernst & Young produce every year in every tax regime on the planet in the hydrocarbon industry. And I said, look, could you just run the Irish numbers through your model and tell me how much profit would an oil and gas company make per annum based on not even messing around with aggressive accounting? And they came back and said, well, it would be 46% per annum.
Now, that does depend, though, on them finding something.
Yeah, but it doubles profits every 1.7
So it's very generous, no matter how you parse it. That's if they find something. Otherwise, they make losses here on the dry holes and all the rest of it, and they'll be writing it off, presumably, if they're allowed in someone else's jurisdiction against the tax they have to pay. But one of the extraordinary things that you point out, and I kind of knew it in my bones, but that ownership of the resources, be it gas or oil, once they get the exploration rights and the drilling rights, it transfers entirely to those companies.
It does, yeah.
There's nothing. We own nothing of our own energy.
Well, one of the extraordinary conclusions I came to, and I didn't come to it lightly, and I say this in the book, that readers shouldn't either. There's lots of meat in this, and that's not mine. There's lots of writers in this book on various topics in this sector, and it's this, that the economic rent. This is a thing I know about from my old days, but actually feel it now. I really feel it now. This idea of the economic rent really is something that I always thought just hit African countries, and the idea that a first world country like Ireland, inside in Europe, could actually was being exploited seemed to me to be completely alien. I didn't believe it until I started to read into it myself. And yet that's what's happening. The economic rent is the amount of money in excess of normal profits that should go to the owners of the assets. Now, the owners of the assets are the citizens of this country, not the state. The state is simply the trustee of the assets that are owned by us as individuals. And the state has organised this licensing regime from 1987, and it has passed the ownership, as you've described it, to the private oil companies, even though we own the assets. So it's a bit like you wake up in the morning and you're now a life tenant in the property that you used to own without you even knowing about it. And that's wrong at a fundamental level. So now, the licences are the licences, and they are protected arguably under the Constitution, property rights and so on. What can be done is the taxation system around them can be tightened up, and there's a lot of suggestions on how that can be done in the book. But in addition, future licences have to fundamentally change. We need to set up a national oil company. We need to do exactly what the Norwegians did. In my opinion, we need to learn how to do this for ourselves, and then over time extract more and more for the citizens of this country. Now, if there isn't an oil and gas future bonanza out there in the North Atlantic, a large proportion of which we own as citizens, if it doesn't happen, then it doesn't happen. It can remain, what's there can remain in the ground. But as it stands, what's happening is that we're passing this over to a very, very small number of quite wealthy private shareholders in oil exploration companies for a handful of colouredy beans.
The argument about our own oil, our own gas, there will be people who'll say, look, let them at that because the future is alternative. It's our wind, it's our wave, bit of solar thrown in, but that's the way we should concentrate our efforts, because the evidence suggests that these big multinational oil companies, oil exploration companies, are not that interested in Ireland.
Well, the evidence at the moment, but Ireland, what you have to look at it as they look at it in 30, 40, 50-year cycles. I know it's hard, but that's the way they look at it, and they plan accordingly. It's quite clear that the oil and gas deposits off Norway are now peaking this year. So in other words, they're hitting the maximum level they think they'll extract. And so therefore the game moves on to where is the next areas that you can get oil and gas from. Now, the technology is there now that wasn't there in the 70s to be able to harvest locations like our waters. But it's not happening yet. But just because it's not, and this is the circular argument, just because it's not happening yet, just because there has been no huge oil strike, doesn't mean you sit back and do nothing. The Irish strategy at the moment, actually it's not a strategy, Pat, it's just a pricing policy. And it's this: give it away for nothing, let the lads get a good clip out of it, and then we'll screw the next lads in with a different licensing regime. Now that is rural parish pump, garmless thinking. That simply won't work. What we need to do is do exactly what the Norwegians did in 1972, adopt the same set of principles, utilise them if we have to, and map our future the way they've mapped theirs, and ignore the noise from the industry that actually what they're saying. On the one hand, there's no oil and gas there, so you shouldn't even be worried about it, and on the other hand, they're telling people from whom they're trying to raise money, lads, there's lots of oil and gas there. Now, at the beginning you contrasted the UK government's attitude and the Norwegian government's attitude, the same field shared but divided at the territorial boundaries in the North Sea. And what was the difference in the take, if you like, that the British government got compared to the take that the Norwegian government got? Well, I mean, the British have no sovereign wealth fund. They have nothing left from. They just spent it on current spending over the decades. The Norwegians have a sovereign wealth fund because they had a set of principles, which is that this is what we're going to do when this happens. We're going to put the money into a sovereign wealth fund. We're going to qualitatively improve the lifestyle of every single Norwegian citizen. We're going to own and run this show ourselves, and these are our terms. The British approach was more along on the fringe of what you would call the curse of oil, and that was they relied far more on private industry to go and take the risks, and then they would tax. But the British taxation system is tighter than the Irish taxation system, and has tightened up even further recently. So they didn't do such a bad job in Britain. But compared to Norway, I mean, Norway is stellar in comparison to practically all other oil and gas regimes, particularly those in what needs to happen next? Because we saw there that we got a regime that would have been good for the Irish people under Justin Keating. Now, there weren't that many discoveries during his period, but we have Pat Rabbitte, who has responsibility in this area, and years and years ago he had a different view to the one he holds today, which is one that is espoused by his department officials now and by a lot of the industry, who say it's hard to find and expensive to extract. Well, it's quite clear that the Irish Department of Energy, Natural Resources and the Marine, which has in it the Petroleum Affairs Division, or PAD, which is a small number of staff, has over many decades become industry captive. They're the regulator. They're captive so much that they actually have a joint venture operation with the oil exploration companies for seismology. So the regulator is actually investing with the people that it's regulating. And there is no difference between the press statements made by the department and the press statements made by the oil and gas industry.
You make an extraordinary charge early in the book about Irish technical people, the roustabouts or whatever they call themselves on drilling rigs, that when certain wells were being drilled, that they made sure the Irish weren't on hand to have a look at what was coming out.
That's right, and the samples as well can be interfered with, and a dud sample can be sent to the whatever government it is, whatever government is examining what's going on. I mean,
this is not just Ireland.
Oh no, it would be common practice, and that's one of our writers in the book, explaining his experience. But what needs to happen here, really, which is your question, is that Owner Oil, which is actually a campaign, it's just starting with a book, and is about getting information down into the grassroots in Ireland through communities, through schools, through universities, so that all the information they require is there. This idea that this topic is really just for experts, for those in the department and the mighty inside in the oil, petroleum companies, one of whom recently described me in a radio debate I had about a year ago, described me as one of, like, hearing a voice in Pixie Land. Well, the Pixies are back, right? We've got a book, we've got all the information there, and we want to share this information with the owners of the oil and gas assets, so that on the very simple basis, Pat, that the Irish establishment, particularly the politicians, really aren't very interested in this topic, because the public aren't. And they're about as knowledgeable as the public are, and I was on the topic. So what we're trying to do is, if we can change, when we change public opinion, when people read this book, they will change their opinion. I'm sure you changed yours to some degree. So it's challenging the existing mindset. And when public opinion changes, the practices that political opinion follows on the basis that the behaviour is to lead from behind.
This is not a book about being a Luddite. I mean, you're not against exploration and development and all that. It's not about being a protester on the banks of the Corrib gas field or anything like that. This is about doing it right and getting our share.
Being savvy, being courageous and being ambitious.
Well, the book is called Own Our Oil, subtitled A Fight for Irish Economic Freedom. It's published by Liberties Press. It's on sale certainly in the next 24 hours in all good bookshops, and it's priced at €17. And the man who put it all together, Eddie Hobbs, thank you very much for joining us.